Some of the facts are a little hazy because this happened when I was a child, but I can still recall the key points. I grew up in Nebraska and I used to bike to school every day because my parents were always working. It was just easier that way. We lived in a rural area surrounded by farmland, and the route to school took me past this massive cornfield. Looking back, it probably wasn't that big, but it was the kind of place that looked like it went on forever. Especially when you're a kid. Our house was on the other side of the field, but my parents were always clear about one thing: don't cut through the cornfield. They were worried I'd get lost without a cell phone, and I didn't really question it. I'd seen how easy it was to lose your sense of direction in there. So every day I'd stay on the main road and bike all the way around it. I didn't have many friends that lived near my house, so I'd always bike alone. I didn't mind the longer rides. I actually developed a love for biking from doing it so often. I'd go for bike rides on the weekends, even when I didn't have to. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but it was definitely a weekday because I was biking home from school. I was biking home like normal when the chain on my bike popped loose. I don't remember how it happened, but it just came off completely. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't figure out how to pop it back into place. My dad had taught me how to fix my bike, but nothing I tried worked. I was stuck, and the thought of walking all the way home with my bike in tow sounded awful. Like I said, I didn't have a phone back then, so it wasn't like I could just call my parents for help. I knew better than to ask a stranger driving by for a ride, so I looked over at the cornfield and realized that I was going to save a ton of time by cutting across it instead of taking the usual route home, which would take forever. When I pushed my bike into the cornfield, I told myself it would be a quick shortcut. At first, it was fine. The path between the rows of corn was narrow, but it was clear enough to walk through the stalks towering over me, and I remember there being a gentle breeze that day. However, when I saw a cornfield as a child, the stalks felt 10 times higher and everything felt 10 times bigger. I knew my parents had warned me to go in there, but I reasoned that it couldn't be that difficult to find my way through, since I just needed to walk straight ahead. I can't recall why, but it was strangely quiet inside, and the corn also blocked off a lot of the light. Occasionally, I glanced behind me. I'm not sure what was scaring me, but I remember just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. After another few minutes, I started to pick up on a faint rustling sound coming from the corn just a little ways off the path. I stopped and listened, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. It didn't sound like the wind, though it stopped, but as soon as I started walking, I heard it again. This time it was a little louder and a little closer. I started to think it could have been an animal stalking me, but I didn't know what kind of animal would be making that much noise. I remember struggling to breathe, wishing I had never got into that cornfield at all. I picked up the pace, walking faster, but I didn't want to leave my bike behind. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but every few minutes the rustling came back, like whatever it was keeping pace with me. Eventually the rustling stopped and I felt a wave of relief. Maybe 10 or so minutes passed without any strange sounds. At the next juncture, I decided to switch roads just to be safe. I turned a corner, and standing right there in the middle of the path was a man. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, staring at me. He didn't look like a farmer or anyone who belonged out there. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had what looked like long scratches on both arms. I don't know how else to describe them. They were just long marks that looked etched into his arm. I froze, not knowing what to do, but then he spoke. He asked me if I was lost in a low and raspy voice. I didn't respond. I was glued to the spot. He then took a step toward me and told me he'd help me find my way home. I felt like I was in sleep paralysis. I literally couldn't move. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't. He started walking faster, his hands outstretched toward me, and that's when my legs just took over. I dropped my bike and ran as fast as I could. He started chasing me and shouted that he just wanted to help me. I did not stop running. I could hear him crashing through the corn behind me, yelling for me to stop. Every so often I ducked into one of the corn stalks and crouched down in a ball with my eyes closed. I tried to make myself as small as possible. I truthfully thought I was going to die. He was holding something that looked like a rope in his hand. As he passed, he muttered to himself, "I'll find him." I'll never forget those words. For as long as I live, I stayed hidden for what felt like hours. My legs were cramping and my whole body was trembling, but I didn't dare move until I was sure he was gone. When I finally crawled out of the corn and made my way home, I was shaking so badly I could barely walk. It was dark by then. I eventually found my way home. I ran inside of my parents, who were worried sick about where I had been. I told them everything. My mom was in tears, and my dad looked like he was ready to kill someone by then, though there wasn't much they could do. That man was long gone when I returned home. From school one day, my old bike, the one I had left in the cornfield, was sitting on the porch. My dad had gone out to find it, but it was nowhere to be found. They got me a new one a few days later, and life continued on until something else happened a few weeks later that finally forced us to move out. My parents didn't feel secure with me in that house longer, so we moved out right away. My parents don't really talk about what happened, but I don't believe I'll ever be able to forget it. I can't remember who was more terrified, me or my parents. I had just returned home to assist my aging parents on the family farm, which wasn't exactly what I had planned for myself after leaving home years ago, but they were getting older and running the place alone was becoming more of a burden. The farm was quiet and remote, surrounded by vast fields of corn that stretched for miles in all directions. I was 28 years old and had been trying to pursue my dreams of becoming an author by writing for a popular newspaper, but things didn't work out. The closest neighbor lived about 10 minutes away on a small farm run by an elderly woman who had lived there since her husband died a few years ago. For a week or two, things were going pretty normally, and I didn't mind that because I was starting to get used to the routine of running the farm, and the slower pace of life was really helpful to me. I had a lot of free time to think and write, which is how I spent most nights. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm most creative and productive at night, so I took advantage of the fact that I'd finish the farm chores well before the sun set, then sit at my computer until I was unable to keep my eyes open any longer. I had chosen to stay in the small bedroom on the third floor so as not to disturb my parents with my odd sleeping patterns. I liked it up there. It was quiet and comfortable, and the window provided me with a lovely muse-like view of the farm. However, after about a week, I began to notice something strange. Every evening just before sunset, I would see a figure standing at the far edge of my parents' cornfield between two rows of corn. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was someone from the neighbor's farm, perhaps checking on their land or surveying the crops. They weren't actually on my parents' property, so it's not like they were trespassing or something. It was just a little strange. The figure didn't move or make any kind of gesture, and I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a mannequin. The scene would definitely make a cool photo, I thought, despite the eerie nature of it all. A shadow against the golden evening sky and fields of corn that seemed to go on forever. A few more days went by, and the figure kept showing up, always at the same time, always standing in the same spot. One night, I paid close attention to make sure it wasn't a scarecrow, but eventually I noticed it move, which confirmed that it was a person. It was strange, but I kept telling myself it was harmless, even though I thought it might be the neighbor. The elderly woman, in retrospect, it probably wasn't a good idea to be so casual about the situation. My mother frequently mentioned that I hadn't seen her since I returned, but perhaps she had a reason for being outside our property. In any case, there was only so much damage an elderly woman could actually do. It's not like she posed a threat to my parents or their property. Over the next few days, things started to change. Every night, I would see the figure getting closer to the house, always between two different rows of corn. It was still silent and motionless, but I was certain that it was getting closer every night. I couldn't make out any details about them from that distance, but things were getting serious now, and after 2 nights of this, I decided I had to do something. The following morning, I told my parents what I had been noticing for the past few weeks, and my mom dismissed it, telling me that it was probably the neighbor's son, who had always been a bit of an oddball. She said that calling him an oddball was a bit of an understatement, but my mom always wanted to put things nicely, so I was surprised when one evening, while working late in the barn, I looked toward the edge of the field and felt sick to my stomach. I noticed that the figure was no longer at the far edge of the cornfield, but rather was standing just outside the property line, much closer than before. I wiped my hands on my jeans, and feeling a mixture of frustration and uneasiness, I decided to go take a closer look. I shouted, "Who's there?" as I approached the field's edge, but the figure turned and ran between a row of corn. I tried to follow it, but as I turned the corner, I saw him literally dive into a row of corn and vanish from view. My heart was racing as I stood there looking around the field, but there was no way I'd be able to find him. It's not like I was going to start searching blindly through the corn stalks. I was really freaked out at that point. Even if that had been a troubled kid, I don't think I was comfortable with him on the property. The next morning, I headed over to the neighbor's farm hoping to clear things up. The old woman answered the door, so I just asked her bluntly without sugarcoating things. She seemed really confused when I told her about what was happening. She shook her head slowly and told me she hadn't been outside after dark for weeks because of her health. She told me that she could barely get around, let alone walk to the edge of her land. I then asked her about her son. She told me that he left home years ago and hadn't lived with her since. I froze as she told me that I could feel my skin start to itch. Whoever I had chased the day before wasn't her son, it was a complete stranger. I left her farm with a growing sense of dread. Whoever or whatever was lurking near the cornfield wasn't from her place. I immediately told my parents about what she told me, and they grew concerned. My mom suggested calling the police, but my dad insisted that would be a waste of time since they hadn't actually done anything illegal. My dad instructed me to stay awake and wake him up should that person come back, which I agreed to. For the next few days nothing happened, like the figure wasn't there anymore, which was a relief. Maybe they had noticed me confronting my neighbor, or maybe they had simply decided not to return after being chased. Either way, I was relieved. Later that week I was out in the barn finishing up some chores when everything went dark. When I say dark, I mean that the entire farm was suddenly plunged into darkness and the power cut out without warning. All the lights inside and outside the house flickered off. I never carried my phone on me in the barn, so I was truly blind. My heart started racing. I had a feeling I knew what had caused the outage when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the cornfield. I realized that I was about to run around the house to check on the breaker man. I fumbled in the dark for the flashlight, which I knew was nearby somewhere, and then I ran out of the barn and toward the house before stopping in my tracks. I wanted to run inside, but I knew that would be the cowardly thing to do. That individual was within a few feet of me on my property. I turned and swept the beam of flashlight across the field, trying to be as quiet as possible. For a moment, nothing happened, just the same rustling sounds, but then out of the corner of my eye I caught a glimpse of movement. I jumped and shakily pointed my light toward the source. There, just a few feet away from the barn, was a man. I could see that now. It was a man with a few patches of hair on an otherwise bald head. He was wearing overalls and staring directly at me with this menacing look. I glanced down at his hands. He was holding a rusty garden tr. Fear took over me and I ran. To my horror, I heard him began to chase after me. I sprinted into the cornfield hoping to lose him, and there I turned to see him in full pursuit, running as fast as he could. I turned a corner, and before he could see, I fell and dove into a row of corn. I sat there with my heart racing, trying to cover the sound of my breathing. A few seconds passed before I saw that guy run past me. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. I wanted to make a dash for my phone and call the police, but I was too afraid. I sat there silently for a few minutes contemplating the situation and my life. Eventually I got out of my hiding spot and ran all the way back to the house, which was still cast in pitch black darkness. I woke my parents up by calling the police, who searched the property but found nothing. However, they did discover that someone had thrown a bucket of water on our breaker man, causing the entire outage. The following day, I assisted my parents in installing some additional security measures and even warned the neighbor to exercise caution. I was only on the farm for another month, but nothing happened in that time frame. It killed me to leave my parents alone on the farm with some psycho lurking about, but I had to move on with my life. They hired a farmhand to deal with the chores, so I wasn't really needed anymore. This was by far the most bizarre and unsettling experience I've ever been through. It's something I still think about a lot. I recently moved to Iowa to get away from things. I got some dead-end job that pays a decent buck. It's not so bad. I'm definitely not going to stay out here forever, but the peace and quiet is Good for me, there's a lot of farmland around here, which I'm sure doesn't surprise any of you. The rural environment is definitely not something I'm used to coming from the city and all, but I'm slowly adjusting to it. About 6 months ago, I found a modest home with dirt cheap rent that I lived in for a few months. While the house itself was small, the property was actually pretty big. I had a lot of land in the backyard, more than I knew what to do with. I'm not sure if it was a farm or abandoned, but there was this massive cornfield that sat right next to my house. Like, the field ended at a little wooden fence that sat a few feet from the physical structure. You could practically touch the outside of the house and the fence at the same time. That's how close they were. As you could probably guess, I didn't have any neighbors. Despite what you might think, I found the isolation really peaceful. Sometimes in the evening, I found myself staring into that field from the window, reflecting about my life. As the stalks billowed gently in the wind, I probably would have stayed in the house for a longer period of time had it not been for what I'm about to tell you. It was a windy October night, one of those cold nights that makes you want to sit in the comfort of a warm bedroom and look out the window at the wind blowing things around. I actually like being outside when the weather's like this. I know I'm a little odd in that regard. There's just something about shoving my hands in my jacket pockets when it's cold that makes me feel good. I was about to finish a cigarette on the back deck of the house, surveying the yard one last time before returning inside, when I heard a scream. This was not the kind of far-off animal cry you occasionally hear in the country. Rather, it was sharp, high-pitched, and unmistakably human. It sounded like it might have been a child, possibly a young boy, and it came from the cornfield just beyond the house. Without thinking, I ran inside, grabbed my hunting rifle, and left again. I'm not sure what happened to me, but I couldn't ignore a child who might be in danger, so I ran toward the cornfield. Louder this time, I stopped in my tracks and scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. I called out to the kid, asking him to scream again so I could find him. I then jumped the fence, picked a random row of corn, and ran alongside it, using my phone's shabby flashlight to see, but he never responded. Eventually, I realized I was in over my head, so I called the police and told them what I had heard, and then I went back to my house to wait for them. When the officers arrived, I insisted on helping them search the field, and they allowed me to do so, for which I was grateful. We searched for at least 30 minutes, calling out to the kid the entire time, but he never responded, and we searched for at least 30 minutes, but there were no footprints, no signs of movement, and no indication that anyone had been in that field. Eventually, we gave up, and the officers told me to call again. Even though I tried to convince myself that it had all been a prank, I couldn't relax after that. I was upstairs getting ready for bed when I noticed something outside the window. It was the last thing anyone would ever want to see outside a bedroom window, a faint orange glow. If I heard anything and left, I was frustrated, but what could I do? Part of me wondered if the entire thing had been a prank, which kind of made sense. I'm sure the kids out there struggled to occupy the hours. I felt sick to my stomach as I hurried to the window and seeing tiny flames blazing madly in the darkness as they rose from the fields. The fire wasn't very big, but I knew it would spread quickly because of how windy it was outside, so I remember yelling "holy _ repeatedly. I realized I had to do something, so I ran down the stairs and called 911, virtually screaming into the phone. I grabbed the hose from the side of my house, turned it on, jumped the fence, and ran into the field. I prayed that it would last long enough to reach the fire. I was soaked by the time I got there, but I didn't care because I knew it would take forever for the fire department to arrive. I sprayed the flames as best I could, doing everything I could to contain it. I was incredibly lucky that it hadn't spread more quickly because I was able to put it out completely in a matter of minutes. I leaned down to catch my breath, wondering why in the world this _ was happening to me. I was standing there, drenched in sweat and water. I turned and almost died right there. thinking that someone was in my bedroom. I dropped the hose that was still spraying water, ran toward the house, threw open the door, and burst into the kitchen, only to freeze in place. The room was completely destroyed. When I heard the front door slam, I spun around and ran to the front door, but by the time I got there, whoever had been inside was gone. I hurried outside again, but they were nowhere to be seen, and I didn't have the energy to chase them down. My fridge and cabinets were all open, and several of my dishes had been smashed on the floor. It was crazy, and I didn't know what to think. I actually thought I was going to faint from the chaos of what had happened, but when the police and firefighters finally arrived a few minutes later, I told them what had happened, and they took it much more seriously this time around. They treated it like a serious felony, and more police officers and even some police dogs were brought out to conduct a more thorough search, but again, nothing was found, so they had enough time to flee on foot for a few weeks. I couldn't sleep, and every rustle in the night made me uneasy. I slept with my hunting rifle on the floor next to me every night until I was able to move out. I kept thinking about what had happened, and it didn't make sense, but what bothers me the most is that first scream. It makes me sick to think that a child might have been in danger not even 100 yards away.